My name is Errol Harhoff, University of Auckland, and I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual tour of Hobsonville Point, one of a number of tours that we've arranged as part of the conference. This was, of course, intended to be an in-person walk around Hobsonville Point, but given the crisis that we're all dealing with, it is now a virtual tour. But in that virtual tour, we're going to try and capture the spirit of this place. Just before we begin moving around on our virtual tour, I thought it was important just to give a brief overview and introduction to what we're going to see. What we've got here is 167 hectares of land that previously was an Air Force base that dates back to the 1930s. In the 1930s, it was a flying boat base, and we can see the remnants of that history in what you can probably see at the moment. The hangars that still exist but have been repurposed for various uses. There's a microbrewery, there are various cafes, and indeed a market that has been established in and around these historic buildings. This space where we're standing now, which is where the ferry arrives, is also intended to have a number of apartment buildings. These will be around about 10 floors high, that will very much bring a sense of strong urbanity to this area known as Catalina Bay. The land ownership was originally that of the government, and that was transferred as part of the beginning point to the development to a special government development agency that was set up at the time. This now goes back over 10 years, 12 years ago, the Hobsonville Point Land Company. And what they adopted was a PPP, a public-private partnership model of housing delivery. But they did that in a particular way by putting together what they called development partners or building partners, and each partnership comprised of a builder together with architects and other professionals, and each of them were allocated a particular block for development. And because there were so many different designers and actors in play, you ended up with a high degree of variability in the housing outcomes, and we'll see some of that as we move through what we're going to see. One of the underlying principles with Hobsonville Point has been to build at a much higher density. In fact, the density that you can see in the housing around here is about 3 to 4 times denser than the conventional suburban areas around Auckland. What we're also seeing here is an example of a building block. The whole of Hobsonville Point was broken down into a series of building blocks. The design was also guided by a set of urban design principles that set key things like orientation, access to private open space, which you can see behind here in these little terraces, privacy, and so on. But how each building partner and each architect responded was entirely up to them. So that leads to a great deal of variation between the various building blocks, and so you get variability. But as you can see behind us here at the moment are examples of standalone houses combined with terrace houses. These are 2 stories high. Each of them, these open towards the sun, as we are seeing them now. There's a small front yard in front of the main living spaces on the ground floor, and the bedrooms are on the upper floor. The idea of this green space we now are standing in is that this is a shared space for the residents who live around the space. And in order to deliver necessary well-being in combination with higher density living, crucially here, the public open spaces such as this small space we're standing in now becomes the backyard for the people, the residents living around it. This is where children play. Can't see any at the moment, but this is where they do come. This is where birthday parties will be held and so on. The other key thing about Hobsonville Point was its clear vision that the development agency set right at the outset, which was to build a strong, vibrant community that sets new benchmarks for quality and accessible urban development with an environmentally responsible focus. And included in that vision, or realizing that vision, required building at much higher density. In fact, 3 to 4 times higher than one would typically find elsewhere in Auckland. It's projected to have around 4,500 to 5,000 houses when completed in 2024, with around 11,000 to 12,000 residents. It is just over the halfway mark towards that aim at the moment, with about 6,500 to 7,000 residents. A key part, to what's important about Hobsonville Point was the very early development of a master plan. That master plan set out some key elements to the new neighbourhood. First of all, it laid out the location of the main spinal road that runs through the centre. It also set out a key part of the public infrastructure, which is a 5-kilometre coastal walkway which runs around the edge and connects the development and the people using that coastal walkway to the unique coastal setting on the Waitemata Harbour. The other thing that the master plan did was to set out various precincts, and within each precinct, development blocks. The development blocks in the street pattern take a grid form, distorted grid form, which ensures high degree of permeability in terms of movement, both vehicular movement, but particularly pedestrian movement. The other thing that's embedded into that master plan is the idea that everybody lives within 5 to 10 minute walk of public open space, and indeed of one of the schools. There are 2 schools in the area. The other key part to that public infrastructure is a series of green spaces that range from very large ones called Bomb Point Park down to smaller, more intimate spaces that connect much more directly to the housing developments that surround them. Also important in that infrastructure has been an investment to ensure that there's a degree of activity that gets facilitated, the provision of barbecue facilities, the recycling of an old rifle range to become an amphitheatre available for community use, and the development that has arisen almost spontaneously around community activities such as a community garden and indeed a community library located in an old recycled fridge. In looking more closely at the housing development, some of the key things that one can see and understand is that there's a range of different housing types, from standalone houses to terrace houses to apartment development, and these range again in terms of different heights, so there's a high degree of variability. The size of units is also highly variable, from 1-bedroom units up to 4-bedroom units. So this reflects a diverse range of needs amongst the community it's intended to service. Another key feature of Hobsonville Point, given that it was a government agency-driven development process, was to require each building partner who acquires a development block to deliver 20% of the housing that were defined as affordable to a formula. They had to be first-time home buyers, and there was a maximum price set for the unit, and they couldn't be sold for at least a 2-year period. So that also helped to extend the diversity of community moving into the area. Indeed, from some of the research that we've done in Hobsonville Point, that diversity is clearly indicated in the distribution of the population, from young single people to young people with children to people with teenagers to those at the older age brackets and retired. There is that full range of diversity that we have. On the design of the housing developments, and you will be able to see examples of this as we move around on this virtual tour, the key to it is that although there were a range of different building partners and architects involved, nevertheless, all of them had to comply with a set of consistent urban design principles. And these set parameters, for example, around privacy, about noise between neighbours, sun penetration, orientation, the use of materials and colours and textures, the relationship of the building to the street, getting sufficient distance from the street edge to ensure privacy, and importantly, the inclusion of extensive landscaping, particularly within the streets, including street trees, that became part and parcel of the whole development. So those broad general guidelines were then interpreted by each of the designers and the building partners, but all had to comply with the overall requirement, which was also then checked through an urban design review panel. Another important feature, and this comes to some of the sustainable environmental responses, every house is required to have a water tank that collects rainwater off the roof, and that water tank, the water collected, is used to service for gardening, but also for the toilets and the washing. Moreover, all the runoff that comes from the housing development itself, plus the streets and public spaces, is drained into a series of rain gardens that collect that water outfall, filter it, reduce the amount of outfall that comes out, and any excess is led into a series of detention ponds before it is discharged into the sea, which cleans the water in a organic way, environmental way. Another thing we can see in Hobsonville Point that was all embedded into that master plan was distribution of density in relation to different activities. So for example, along the main spinal road, which is also the bus route, series of bus stops along that, the density tends to be higher, and that is where many of the apartment type of developments are found. Also, in relation to that higher activity movement spaces are many of the retail outlets, cafes, doctors, nail bars, dairies, and so on. And indeed, many of the terrace housing and apartments that face that busy linear road also have the opportunity to be live-work units, so that the ground floor can be used for retail purposes or work from home purposes. And of course that creates a considerable amount of flexibility for people who are living here, the residents. Another interesting observation was what happened in Hobsonville Point through the COVID-19 crisis, and in particular a 3-month lockdown that we went through here in New Zealand, as indeed in many other places around the world, given the fact and notwithstanding the fact that it was a relatively high density development, the easy access to green spaces meant that there was a way in which people were able to deal with all the complications that came from that lockdown. It provided a huge safety relief valve for the community as a whole. Hobsonville Point has been a subject to a major research study that involved the University of Auckland, and in particular School of Architecture and Planning, hosts to this year's APRU conference. One of the big research questions, or two big research questions that we had at that time, was the extent to which the development, as it is now emerging after about 8 years of delivery, is the extent to which it was meeting the fairly high environmental standards that had been set. Secondly, the extent to which it was delivering on the building of a community that was articulated in the vision for the place. So to test those two things out, we did two major pieces of work. First of all, we did a review of the extent to which environmental outcomes were being achieved, the extent to which energy, power consumption had been reduced through various mechanisms that were built into the development plan, the extent to which there were indeed water savings from the use of water tanks, the degree to which the natural areas had been retained, enhanced and developed through extensive planting of, or replacing of native vegetation, and the extent to which nature had been recovered, such as bird life and so on. So we were interested in that set of environmental impacts and how that had been achieved through the development. The second part was to get a resident perspectives on the kind of visions that were being expressed in the master planning process. That yes, it was at a higher density, but was higher density delivering necessary well-being and outcome. So I hope that I've been able to communicate key things about this particular place, what it has achieved, particularly in the context of New Zealand, what lessons can also be learnt from applications elsewhere in our Pacific Rim area that we all connected with. Contexts will vary and differ from place to place, from country to country, but where there are a similar set of contexts that is concerned about developing cities at higher densities, certainly as we are in New Zealand and places like Australia, places like America, West Coast America. There is a whole lot that we can learn, not only from what we've looked at and studied here in Hobsonville Point, but indeed from each other in terms of exchanging ideas about how to do that best, not only to deliver on the designer visions of how to make these places, but to also understand the extent to which we are delivering an outcome that is fully appreciated by the people who end up living in these places.